which is really difficult because you have kids who are only there because their parents want them to get into Harvard, and they think debate's going to do that. Spoiler alert, if you don't like debate and you're only there because your parents want you to be, that is not going to go very well. And we also have kids who are really into debate, and we had freshmen through seniors. So it was a really challenging group. And one thing we did at the end of the school year, because we didn't go to the TSC last year, was we spent a lot of time cutting different files for the education topic, and I made all my students have 1 to 2 practice debates on the education topic. So a lot of this lecture is based on some of the affirmatives that my students cut and that I helped them with, and then also some of the arguments that came up a lot. So that's why I was going to pick on Ian, because he did some good debating on this topic as well. So that's kind of what is the basis of a lot of this lecture, as well as just some research I've also done too. There we go. All right, so one of the reasons that the education topic is kind of a challenging topic, but it's also kind of a good topic as well, is that there's sort of, I think, 2 main advantages and 2 main disadvantages to being asked or neg on this topic. The first one is that it has really good solvency mechanisms. Can anyone explain what solvency is? Yeah, in the back.
How does the plan solve the attack?
Yeah, definitely, right? So a lot of times in debate we have kind of unrealistic solvency mechanisms, right? You have a lot of internal links to your advantages to reach your impacts, and a lot of times you're kind of like, I don't really know if that's going to work out. On the education topic, I think just on a truth level, a lot of these arguments are just kind of functionally true. It's also a lot of real world impacts as well. What do I mean by that? Can someone explain that? Yeah.
It's not thermonuclear war.
What?
It's not like massive war scenarios.
Well, it might result in nuclear war, yeah, that's true. But it also has the real world examples. Can you give me an example of like a real world type impact?
Just like education, econ decline.
Yeah, so things like that are a little more like realistic, right? Does anyone remember hearing about like the Greece economic decline that happened a couple years ago, or are you all too young for that? Oh, people are nodding. It's good. I'm not that old. Yeah, good. All right, right. So we have impacts that are a little more realistic on this topic in a lot of ways. But I think one of the big problems with this resolution, and really one of the reasons that I was really hoping we would have energy this year instead of education. Well, I really wanted ag, but agriculture, but that's a long story. Is that I think the Fed key, or USFG, United States Federal Government key word, is going to be difficult. So the resolution says that the United States federal government has to substantially increase its regulation and or funding, right? But yesterday, Herndon talked a little bit about how education is mostly whose power? States. It's a state or local power. It doesn't mean that the national or federal government doesn't do or does like nothing with education, but it's mostly a state or local power. So finding evidence that's going to suggest that the federal government is key is going to be hard. So one of the things I talk about a lot in my AP government and government classes is this concept of federalism. Has anyone taken AP government? Okay, can you give us, who have I not called it? Yeah, right here. Can you give us a good definition of federalism? Yeah, do you remember? Yeah.
Okay. Federalism is like the way that the national, or federal, and the state and local governments share power. So
yeah, definitely.
The federal government has supremacy over the state, but states still have certain powers to do things within their own reach.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So it's kind of like thinking about it this way, right? You're both a citizen of the United States, and then you also live in Georgia, right? And there's certain things that you can do, that Georgia can do, and also things that you can do as a citizen of the United States. So one example is that you will and your parents pay taxes. They pay taxes both to the state of Georgia, and they pay taxes to the national or federal government, right? When I pay my taxes every year, and it's always way too much money because I'm a teacher and I don't make enough money, I have to pay a lot of money to the national government, and I have to pay a lot of money to the state government of Georgia, right? But both have power over me. Does the government of France have power over me? No, not really, because I'm not a citizen of France, right? So federalism is sort of this idea that we have 2 or more levels of government over the same area. And it's usually grouped into like the national government and then the state or local government. So a lot of the evidence that I was reading and that my students were cutting in the last couple weeks of the semester, spring semester, talked a lot about these states being key to education. And that's difficult because what does the resolution say? Who has to act if you're asked? The federal government. So I think that's going to be hard. And I'll talk more about that later. Another difficult problem with this topic is that a lot of these AFs have long-term solvency. So I'll give you an example. If you read an AF that says we have to increase science and or STEM funding, and we have to teach kids how to do science and math. And we have to teach them that in kindergarten, and it's going to train them to be really good scientists and leaders in the world. That is probably going to take about 25 years to actually happen, right? If you start teaching them intense math and science in like kindergarten or first grade, they're not, unless they're like really brilliant. Like, have y'all seen Ellen DeGeneres and she's got that like really brilliant kid this year? Do you know what I'm talking about? Any of you? Okay. But most people, if they start learning intense math and science in elementary school, are not really going to be able to deliver on those impacts for about another 15 to 25 years. So I think that's a big problem, is that a lot of these apps have kind of long-term solvency. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some common affirmatives that I think will be on the topic this year, and these are just sort of my predictions, as well as some that some of my students cut, or I had them also turn in solvency advocates, so I made each student or had them, I think, pair up some of the beginners or novices. And so some of the evidence that I think will be popular this year for being affirmative, or just some common apps. It's not really an exhaustive list. I'm just going to talk about 3 or 4 in general, and then I'll kind of mention some others. One that is absolutely going to be, this is all predictions because obviously the season has not started yet, but I think one that's going to be a really big one is the Transgender Bathrooms App, right? One thing I did at the end of the school year was I invited some other teachers and my principal to come in and talk to the students, and one of the key issues that kept coming up was this issue of transgender bathrooms. And the reason for that is that the Obama administration basically told schools that they needed to provide an option for transgender students to use the bathroom they wanted to use. So if you were born male but identified as female, if you were born female identified as male, you could use the bathroom that you identified with, not the bathroom that you were born with gender. Does that make sense? Okay. Then the Trump administration basically said we disagree with that and they should use the bathroom that they were born with. Okay? This is, regardless of what you think about transgender bathrooms, this is kind of good for debate because it sets uniqueness for your, or inherency basically, for your affirmative, right? Because you can now say that we need to provide transgender bathrooms for students, right? If the Trump administration says you were born male but identify as female and you have to use the male bathroom, affirmatives can now come in and say that you have to use the bathroom that you identify with, regardless of the one that you were born with. Does that make sense? Right? What is the problem with having an affirmative that's already happening? My lab talked about this a little yesterday. Can someone tell me what the problem is with that? Yeah, blue shirt, right here.
Then nothing's changing.
Yeah, so what? What if I introduce an app, nothing's changing? Okay. Why does that matter?
Because it has to be different from the past.
Yeah, but why? You know why? You're not in the blue shirt. What's your name? No, blue shirt. Kristen. Oh yeah, you're in my lab, sorry. Yeah, Kristen. Why does that matter if nothing's changing?
Because like the point of the plan is to change.
Okay, but why? Why does the plan have to change to make them the status quo?
To be different from what the company has.
Yeah, does anyone know why though? Anyone else? Yeah, Richard.
To stop the potential impact.
Yeah, it has to be able to garner unique offense basically for the impacts, right? If I say that we're going to give textbooks to students and you already have textbooks, I can't claim any unique impacts because you already have access to those impacts, right? I have to prove that my plan is different from the status quo. Is anyone confused by that? Okay. Alright, so these kind of affirmatives will create protections for transgender students at schools in kind of a variety of ways, and I think it would probably have to be through like a court mechanism would be my guess, but I think a lot of the camps this summer are probably going to put out affirmatives about this. I would also be watching like what camps like Michigan State or Northwestern are putting out as parts of their evidence as well. One thing that you can do, especially if you're on a small school or even if you're on a big school, is look at what other camps are putting out. For example, Wake Forest yesterday, they have a 1-week Wake Early Bird. They put out some affirmatives yesterday. I already downloaded those and put them in our, or actually I asked one of my students too, but I already looked at them and one of my students is going to put them in our Dropbox, and so we can see what our other camps putting out, because a lot of what students will read this year on the topic is decided by what the camps over the summer put out. So it's definitely good to look at what Emory is pointing out, but we also want to see what other camps are putting out, right? Because not all debaters in the world go to Emory. Okay, just the good ones. Alright, so this kind of app would probably create protections for transgender students, allowing them to use the bathroom that they personally identify with. Alright, I think another big one is going to be about STEM education. Hernan talked about this a little yesterday. The U.S. lags really far behind other countries in STEM education. So this chart, I don't know if you can see on the bottom, this is the STEM degrees awarded as percent of all degrees in 2011. So this is China. What percentage of degrees? 41%. India is 26. UK 22. Japan's 18. Brazil 14. The U.S. is 13%. Right? This is just like one chart. One thing you'll learn in debate pretty quickly is that you can always find evidence on both ways, right? Regardless of what you believe, there have been very strange debates that I have been in and I have judged and won on very strange arguments, right? I once watched a debate where people won on the argument that aliens were good and were going to destroy the planet. Okay? So we can always find evidence to lie. I mean, I can find evidence that says the opposite of this. But this is one thing that I think is a very common and just like on a truth level is very true. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that the U.S. lags behind other countries in STEM education. So, quick review. What is STEM? Who can tell me?
Science, technology, engineering, math.
Very good. Okay. So, ask a new variety of things to promote STEM education, and they can use a lot of different mechanisms, right? They could establish mentorship, they could fund previously successful programs, a lot of evidence that suggests that there are programs that work that didn't have funding to continue. They can also make STEM careers more attractive. What do you think would be some impacts that would result from like a STEM app? Can anyone give me some examples? Yeah.
Hedge.
Okay, why?
Because like if we have like a lot of like engineers and like scientists, like we'd be able to create like more like weapons, or we'd be able to create stuff that could like put the U.S. ahead of other countries.
Absolutely, right? It would give the U.S. probably an advantage in American hegemony, right? How many of you debated the China topic last year? Good. There were a lot of arguments that suggested that China was trying to rise and take over the U.S.'s place in the world order, right? China Rise. Anyone read those kind of dissents? Any MBA students? Right? They were reading that argument a lot. The balancing dissent type stuff. Remember that? Okay. Right? So an appeasement type arguments that suggested that it would be really bad if the U.S. lost its place as the world hegemon. So STEM careers would be more attractive. But again, I think there are some problems with this act too. They have to find an answer to the fact that a lot of this would not happen immediately. So I think a smart version of this act would probably invest in something that would happen immediately instead of like mentoring them as children. They would probably do something that would immediately help them, such as, funding successful programs, making careers more attractive, bringing people to the U.S. to invest in American science programs and that sort of thing. Okay. And then sort of the third group of apps that I think will be, and by the way, another camp is putting out the STEM app. I don't think I'm supposed to know that, but they are, so stay tuned for that one. All right. Teacher quality apps, this is going to be a big one. So a lot of you are privileged to go to schools where you have overwhelmingly good teachers. You may have had one or two bad apples, but overwhelmingly, most of you would probably agree that you've had a couple at least good teachers in your lifetime. But there are major problems with teachers quitting the profession. I'll give you one example from my life. I had degrees from Emory and Vanderbilt, and I applied to about 45 teaching jobs my first year, and I got interviews at 3. And the reason for that is not because my resume was bad, it's because of this statistic that 45% of new teachers will leave the profession within the first 5 years of teaching. Because it's kind of a risky bet to bet on a first-year teacher. A huge percentage of them will drop out of teaching. Does anyone know why? Yeah.
Teaching's really hard?
Teaching is really hard, okay? You work a lot of long hours. A lot of times students are really difficult. There's a lot of administrative problems. The pay is relatively low. There are a lot of big problems with teaching. Yeah?
I was going to say low pay.
Low pay is a big one, right? There's a lot of reasons that other careers can be more attractive. So despite the fact that I think, I had a good resume, it was still hard to get jobs. And I was really fortunate to end up at Alpharetta, which is where I wanted to go. But, if I hadn't, it would have been bad news. So, okay. 10% will even resign mid-year, and these numbers actually go up in low-income schools as well. Teachers are also statistically will work more unpaid overtime, and 40% of people with degrees in teaching will actually never teach at all. So they'll complete their teaching requirements, and then they'll decide to do something else. So I think there are a lot of apps that will do things about teacher quality or shortages. A big problem is that there are massive teacher shortages in the schools that are not as high quality. So In schools like the North Fulton areas, I know a lot of my students in my lab are from like Cambridge, Chattahoochee. Those schools do not have teacher shortages. But if you're in a school that is a more of what's called a high need school, those schools have massive teacher shortages. So I think affirmatives are going to try to do a lot of things to kind of fix that problem. And there's sort of two things that research suggests students will do, the teachers will do and like stay in teaching. And the first one is that if they're assigned like a mentor to help them, and they're also if they have a supportive administrator. So schools are generally structured so that there's like teachers, then there's the administration, and then the principal is kind of the head of the administration, right? So at Alpharetta, there's like the teachers, and then there's the social studies administrator is over me, and that's who I sort of report to directly, and then there's my principal. So I think apps are going to suggest a variety of methods to establish different types of programs to encourage and attract teachers to the teaching profession. Increasing salaries is also going to be a big one. Starting salaries are really low, $35,000, pretty low number. Different things you could do, but that's going to link to other disads. What packet disad would that increasing salaries link to? Pretty hard. The spending disad who you might talk to yesterday. All right, and then there are like some other ones that my students and I talked about a lot in the spring semester. Does anyone know what the school to prison pipeline is? Yeah.
Essentially saying that kids drop out of school and don't potentially go right back into prison.
Okay, yeah, that's a good summary. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that students who drop out of school do not make good choices, and there's a lot of factors that influence them into doing that, right? If you're not in school, you're not being supervised, you might make poor decisions, you might be bored, you might make some bad decisions, right? And there's a lot of factors, and it's not really their fault, it's a lot of factors that suggest there are reasons that students drop out of school. So they might be asked to do a number of things to lead students to try to stay in school, to make school more attractive. One example is a school that I used to volunteer at through the Urban Debate League in Atlanta when I was in college. They decided to put their elective classes, which students thought were more fun, so that would be things like art or music, first period. Why do you think they tried to do that? Yeah?
Because it's like the first thing of the day, so you start your day like when you're excited.
Right. And so they thought students would be more likely to go to school if they put their electives first period. Is there a question? Okay. Yeah.
With the school to prison pipeline, would that maybe have links to race or socioeconomic stratification?
Yeah, absolutely. Because statistically, unfortunately, the biggest group of people who are likely to end in prison are African American males. And there's a lot of studies that suggest if an African American male and a Caucasian male are charged with the same crime, the African American male is much more likely to get a harsher sentence, right? If you have a white male and an African American male who are both accused of murder, the African American male is way more likely to get the death penalty. So I think there are a lot of things that you could do to address the school to prison pipeline and everything. There's also a lot of problems with charter schools. Some people think charter schools are really good, some people think charter schools are really bad. Has anyone seen the movie Waiting for Superman? Okay, what does that movie think about charter schools, good or bad? Remember? Yeah.
I mean, it definitely highlighted the fact that it was unfair for certain kids who applied, yet it was such a lottery system that their chances were so low of getting in.
Right, so it said it was low and it was hard for them to get in, but did they want to get into the charter schools?
Well, I remember the one girl had other options and she still wanted to, and then the other kids, their parents also wanted them to move since they saw how poorly their actual local schools were.
Right.
So,
Yeah, but I think for the most part, there's a lot of films that suggest that charter schools can be good. There's some that criticize them and say they can be bad. Hernan talked yesterday a little bit about charter schools. They also have some interesting funding requirements as well, and things like that that could be addressed, through different affirmatives. Another thing is that in the U.S. there's no federal right to education. There's a lot of laws that suggest that you need to go to school. They kind of vary in a lot of ways by state, right? Homeschooling curriculum is different than public school curriculum in a lot of ways. A lot of people will take their children out of public schools to have more religiously themed education as well. So there might be affirmatives that recognize a federal right to education too. I was looking at Wake Forest's early word evidence last night. They put out an affirmative about Milliken v. Bradley. Does anyone know what that case is about? Yeah.
Redrawing school district boundaries.
Yeah, it basically says that, or this affirmative basically says that you need to, it's functionally about desegregation because it has the them draw district lines was essentially the attempt to desegregate. So Milliken v. Bradley said that you could draw district lines, and as long as you weren't drawing them to segregate, it was constitutional. However, a lot of those lines ended up being segregated in effect. So it said that you could basically redraw them with the effect of desegregation and have some impact. I'll talk on in a second. There's also apps that address bullying or sexual harassment, which is a big problem in schools as well. Like how many of you have ever heard of a school fight happening in your cafeteria? Right? So things like that are a big problem. And reasons for that, you know, it's hard for teachers with the average class size, you know, in a lot of schools being over 30, it's hard for them to be able to see everything. And they want to eliminate a lot of incentives for bullying as well. Yeah?
How would a school fight in the cafeteria be bullying?
What do you mean?
Like, it says bullying or sexual harassment, and
Yeah.
usually fights are where between two people where it's not really bullying, it's just they want to fight each other.
Well, I would argue that bullying probably leads to the fight, right? Someone's tired of being picked on and so they fight back, or someone is bullying someone and they decide to punch them in the face. So they might have an affirmative that would enhance like cooperation, they would have tolerance and like discussion groups, they might increase counseling opportunities for students, require that all students take a course in cooperation type skills or something like that. Alright. We're going to talk a little bit about some advantage areas as well. So I'm going to talk about some other things as well. I think one thing is that the U.S. military really lags behind. Some of your packet evidence talks quite a bit about how the U.S. needs better educated recruits and that they're kind of lagging behind. It says obesity is a major problem for that as well. So the affirmatives might say that one of the ways we can access a stronger military is to have more educated recruits, and that without that we could kill military readiness and lead to our favorite policy debate, impact of global nuclear war. I think economic competitiveness might also be a major advantage or impact scenario. It's not really unique to this topic, but how could we access an economic competitiveness impact? Anyone explain how? Yeah.
By saying that if like the army is more, not the army, but like the military, if it's more educated, like stronger, then we have more headcount.
How does that access economic competitiveness? Yeah.
So like, if you had like a STEM app or something like
Yeah.
that, like the impact would probably be like economic benefit because like STEM jobs tend to pay higher, so
Right.
there are like the
Right, and then you could probably argue that that would make the U.S. more economically competitive compared to other countries, and then that would probably be like an internal link to your hedge impact. Other things, China rise, I talked about earlier, U.S. will lose to hegemony by falling behind. I also think democracy and soft power and U.S. leadership type impacts that are really popular in every topic will be a major thing this year as well. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this, because Herman kind of did yesterday, unless people have questions on that. And I'll talk more about critical apps in a second. No? Oh, I'm going to post this so you don't have to jot down every word unless you want to. I mean, if you want to, that's fine. Alright, so that's kind of the policy side. Critical apps, there is definitely a lot of different ways that schools perpetuate racism. Here are just like a few real life examples and links to different race-based apps that I've just heard about recently. One really famous example that lots of books that I read in grad school were talking about, and also recently, was white teachers will use kind of white privilege to reinforce ideas of good and bad language. There's a teacher in Brooklyn who was white, who clashed with students and parents because she was correcting language. So she would say, like, if an African American student was saying things like, she's sick, or who you trying to be, she would correct that. And so that's definitely kind of an example of white privilege, to assert that one type of language function is better than another. And she really clashed with students and parents over that. I definitely think that's a link to kind of a race-based affirmative, and you could say that that is a reason that we have to destroy the school system if you're reading more of a critical version of the affirmative. This is a really recent example. Did anyone hear about this Kentucky school that was banning different sort of ethnic hairstyles? Yeah, you hear about this? Okay. So this Kentucky high school banned dreadlocks, braids, twists, and cornrows. And so they were not part of their dress code because they were like distracting to other students and were messy and dirty, basically. And it made really big national news, as it should have, because it's definitely a form of racism to suggest that one type of, hair is not as good as like traditional, white hair. I definitely think a link to a way that schools could be racist. A lot of these you could just also read as like links to a traditional race-based critique, but I also think they will be read on both sides as kind of an affirmative that has race-based arguments. Yeah. Okay. I also want to touch on something that Hernan was talking a little bit about yesterday. So, one thing is that 48% of secondary students said they were sexually harassed at least once in schools. And Hernan spoke yesterday briefly about something called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is a book by a guy named Paulo Freire. This is a really hard book to read. I had to read it, well, theoretically I read it in grad school. I read parts of it. And it criticizes something called the banking model. So this is a little bit of kind of a critique of something very similar to the traditional lecture where the teacher is just like depositing information into students, and students are seen as not really having any knowledge themselves and not really being able to contribute. So the teacher is like this all-knowing person, and the students are just like recipients of the learning. And there's a lot of problems with that, right? One problem is that the teacher doesn't know everything. Another problem is that you definitely come with some information already, right? Like I've been asking you questions and you already know things about this topic, right? So I think there's definitely arguments that can be made that like the traditional school system has a lot of problematic areas. And that would need to be sort of radically reformed. So I think some affirmatives might suggest a radical rethinking or reforming of the school. Suggesting that the teacher knows all is also a major problem, right? Teachers don't know everything. My first year teaching world history, there were a lot of things I didn't know. Thankfully, I don't have to teach that anymore, which is wonderful. Now I teach government, which is a lot more fun. But, you know, there were a number of times I didn't know things the students were asking, and so it was difficult when the students would ask me questions, and I would be ashamed to be like, I don't know. But as I got older, I got more comfortable with realizing that I don't have to know everything, and I shouldn't assume that you know nothing either, right? You are all students in schools. You all learned something about debate because you were in lab yesterday, and some of you knew stuff before that. So Freire has this big criticism of this banking model, and the reason or a way that like it helps me remember it is that it's like the teacher is putting money in you, and you're like the bank, okay? So I think he's going to be a major author on this topic as well. But that could be sort of another form of an advantage where they sort of radically reform schools and get rid of this traditional model, right? Even the way, like, look at this room set up, right? The teacher is up here, the students are facing the teacher. So there could be things that sort of radically reconstruct schools. A good example of this is there's a school, I think it's in DC, it's called like School Without Walls, and their school like just doesn't have walls, right? It's kind of a weird rethinking of schools. Yeah. Okay. A soft left app, I wish I could talk for like an hour and a half on this alone, but kind of the simple definitions of basically has critical advantages with a plan text. So one example would be a plan text that like teaches debate to all students in the United States. Like for example, let's say maybe a better plan text would be like, if you fail American government, you have to take debate, okay? And there might be one advantage of critical thinking, and the app would argue that critical thinking is key to prevent dogmatism. K2 is key to prevent dogmatism, right? It has a plan text. It would say the United States federal government, should require that all students who fail American government have to take a policy debate class. Our advantage is critical thinking. And we argue that's key to prevent dogmatism, and dogmatism is a really bad thing, and people have to know tolerance and such things, right? So that is kind of one example. Soft left apps have become really popular over the last couple of years. Does anyone know why? What are some reasons these kind of apps are strategic? Yeah.
You get to use like critical advantages, but you don't hit T or such everywhere.
Absolutely, right? Does anyone know what that means? Is anyone confused by that? Right? You're not going to debate framework because you're defending the United States federal government, but it's very strategic because you're not defending traditional advantages that people have blocked out. Everyone has their impact defense file ready to go. I have defense econ collapse, I have defense to food wars, right? I probably don't have my defense to critical thinking file handy. But I'm not going to link to these framework arguments because I'm defending the United States federal government. Does anyone go to Milton? Okay, Milton was very successful with this argument, or soft left apps a couple of years ago in the North Georgia circuit. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the app that's in your packet that you're going to be reading while you're at camp, and then at the end, if I have a little extra time, I'm going to talk about some strategies for choosing the app that you should read this year. So this is the plain text of the packet app. When I refer to the packet app, that just means the app that the ENDI has kind of chosen for you. So the United States federal government should mandate and provide funding for farm-to-school programs that significantly increase servings of fresh vegetables and fruits in secondary and elementary schools in the U.S. and make competitive food sales illegal. So what is a competitive food sale? Let's start there. I'll give you a hint, it's on the right. Vending machines. That's what I would probably interpret one of those things as, right? So, you know, in Alpharetta, this is a big problem, right? The school's all like, oh, we're going to serve healthy food, and then kids are like, no, I'm going to go to the vending machine. Okay, that's one example. But basically what the app is going to do is that they're going to provide funding for farm-to-school programs. So basically provide, essentially, it's going to be healthy, organic food to schools. And we're going to get rid of competitive food sales that would result in kids eating bad food. Right? Pretty straightforward? Can anyone think of some reasons this might be a good idea? I know you might not be thrilled about eating organic food, but why might it be a good idea? Yeah?
Is it one of the advantages of the app, like, the obesity epidemic?
Yeah, one of the advantages of having a second says it's going to cut down obesity. Good, what else?
Like, another advantage of this app is that, like, it's not really, like, left or right wing. It's not, like, logic based. Like, obesity is, like, an epidemic, and it's very, like, factually supported.
Yeah, good. Obesity is a major problem, right? See in the status quo? Good. Okay. Other problems too. This is just kind of these are just the tags of Advantage 1, just so you can kind of see it all on one page. I don't really have time to go through each one, but just kind of a brief overview of what this says. And basically, the major kind of impact of Advantage 1 is that obesity is a major problem, that if we switch kids to eating healthy school lunches, they will reduce the obesity epidemic. Do you think that is true? Maybe? Okay. What would you say if you were negative? Yeah.
This is more of like a learned behavior. Like you can't stop a lot of the obesity problem. Like the people are saying that it's a lot from food, but it can also be genetic. Like just feeding kids like into school, that's one meal a day or two at most. That's not going to change our whole society.
Okay, might not change the whole society, right? I think Gabby will talk more about this, but right, might not change the whole society. You still have to eat dinner at home, probably, right? Things like that. But the app is going to argue that obesity is a major problem, but you know, if you're getting crushed in a practice debate, right, a smart advantage usually doesn't just include one impact. What are some other impacts we have here? Yeah.
Justice.
What?
Food justice.
Yo, that's a different advantage. Sorry, on this advantage. Yeah.
Isn't it that, like, obesity increases military readiness?
Yeah, military readiness, right? We have cards that say, actually the card is really powerful. I'm not sure where Herndon found it. Herndon is like magic. He finds cards. When I was debating at Emory, I won so many rounds that I shouldn't have won, because Herndon would have random cards that would be like, the app is going to result in Quebec seceding from Canada, and that's going to be really, really bad. And these other teams would be like, we don't have Quebec defense. I won like a bunch of rounds I shouldn't have won because Herndon would just have these random impacts. Anyway, that's very satisfying. So, anyway, emboldened tariffs, instability, loss of hegemony, diabetes with spiked healthcare costs. I want to talk a little bit about slow growth, because I'm not sure people know what that means. Does anyone know what slow growth is? Any economics people in here? And not a single one? Okay, so what I. Slow growth basically says that a stagnant economy or one that is rising only a slight bit is a bad thing, right? We all know when the economy goes down, that's bad. So slow growth of the economy or one that is like going down is like that, right? Okay. And economic growth. All right, advantage 2 is about food justice. It says the federal government standards are bad, and that it's worse in poor and minority communities, which are also where, like, generally, unfortunately, the failing schools are as well. And then it talks about food justice, which is basically this idea that we have to kind of sustain a population that is able to use food to sort of empower themselves and create food equality. So the cards are going to talk more. I wish I had more time. The cards will talk more about this in detail. You can also talk more about this with your lab leaders. But this card is really important because it says that it's key to combating food injustice and that access is harder for minority students. And that it also contributes to racism and racial inequality. So you kind of have an solvency argument here that the app is going to solve racial inequality. And then the third one is about small farms. So I don't literally mean like a small farm like I have on the right. What do I mean? toy farms. What do I mean? Yeah.
So small farms will get more business out of this.
Well, what is a small farm?
Like just a small family-owned farm.
Yeah, it's like a small family-owned, usually healthy organic farm, right? It's the opposite of something called a CAFO. What is a CAFO? Yeah, it's like a big industrial commercial farm, okay? So the app argues that we're going to shift demand from these big, bad industrial farms to small family-owned farms, and that shift is good. And that's kind of the third advantage, which also claims that it's going to solve global warming, and we're going to cause international modeling. What is international modeling? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When other countries are going to follow what we're doing. So now we have what's called a spillover claim. We're going to argue that not only is the U.S. going to, but other countries are going to do the same thing, and that's good. Okay. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Where will this be posted?
On the wiki. I'll post it after this. After I turn over again. Are there any other questions? I saved about 5 minutes for questions. Yeah.
As far as critical apps go, is there anything gonna be like women in STEM?
Yeah, absolutely, right? I think that's actually going to be a really big one. So there's a lot of statistics that suggest that women, and it's just like true, that women are not encouraged in a lot of ways to take science and technology courses, right? So, and statistically, women also do earn fewer diplomas in those areas as well. It's really interesting because in the U.S., more women go to college than men, but the degrees they earn are not usually in STEM fields. So, I think there will be a lot of apps that suggest different programs and ways for women to achieve those goals.
Okay. I mean, like, I think that, like, a lot of the evidence though, like, sometimes goes with, like, post-secondary education, so how would we link that back to, like, high school or, like, elementary school? Would you start like, programs off pretty early specifically because, like, they had women, or?
Yep.
Okay.
So I think there could be different things, like I think a mentorship program where maybe you have, younger students partner with older students where they would teach them about, different study habits would be successful in those courses, or like peer tutoring or things like that would be really helpful. It kind of depends on what route you want to go. Like, do you want to do like a big stick policy app, or do you want to do like something small and squirrely? Is kind of like I think your first decision you want to make, right? If you wanted to do something like big with these STEM impacts, I think you could be like teaching women about how to empower themselves through STEM is like key to their key to like American hegemony, kind of some of those other impacts I talked about earlier. And I think one thing that might be strategic is to have one sort of traditional STEM advantage, and then one advantage that's a little more smaller and squirrelier about how it combats inequality and has more kind of critical impacts. Might be one thing to consider. Or just go one way or the other. But sometimes teams will do that, and then they'll like kick the one that people are, ahead on. The other questions? Yeah.
So how do we define fresh, like in terms of vegetable and fruit?
How do we define?
Like fresh, like is it gonna be like directly from the small farm?
That's a good question. I don't think teams, it's hard to say now at the beginning of the season, I don't think teams are gonna read like topicality on the word fresh because it's not part of the resolution. And I don't think it's in the T file, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it's in the T file for the ENDI. I think you should just defend that it would be sent sort of relatively quickly from the organic farms to the schools, that it doesn't have preservatives, that sort of thing. Or excessive preservatives or something like that. Alright, I got like one more. No? Okay. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me or just find me. I'm not scary, it's not like Alright.